Welcome to the last video of Chapter 16. In this video, we're talking about dynamic text. Now, this is going to be a long one. I'll go ahead and warn you. The first thing we're going to talk about is fluid text. This deals specifically when you have text that should be scaled based on how the browser is resized smaller or larger. Now, there's a bit of complex calculations for fluid text, and we'll get to this when we get to the calc function. But to get to that first, one thing we have to do is we'll actually cover some media queries. So we'll come back to calc once we've covered media queries so that you have a better understanding about what needs to be done before we jump into calc. First off, media queries. Basically what happens is that you have a set of rules in one sheet, and based on what properties and what values are available, determine what set of rules will be loaded and processed based on what's available. So for example, you have a list right here, segment A, segment B, segment C, and they all say similar things, although slightly different. So basically, if your first segment equals segment A, then you're going to load the segment A items. If your segment changes to B, then you're going to load the segment B items. Same thing for segment equals C. So basically with this, even though it's a very broad example, you can see how the different segments can be loaded based on the value available, in this case A, B, or C. Let's put this in a more real-world perspective. What if instead of just A, B, and C, you have a different time frame of activities you are going to do based on the time of day? So in the morning, such as 9 a.m., you wake up, eat breakfast, and go to school. If the time is 3 p.m., you eat lunch, watch a movie, and go home. If the time is 8 p.m., then you eat dinner, you brush your teeth, and you go to bed. So basically, you have a set of rules that is outlined on your day-to-day activities, and based on the time, you determine what activities need to be done. There's no reason to eat breakfast at 8 p.m., and there's no reason to, say, wake up at 3 p.m., unless you're a lazy college student, or there's no reason to eat dinner at 1 a.m. because, well, that's morning time. So based on that, hopefully you aren't following some kind of weird schedule. This schedule right here is a very basic example of how things can be done based on time frames. So let's take that same example and apply it to styles. Well, the default style for desktops and laptops load this set of rules, and that's your standard set of rules for pretty much anything. Then once you get into more of a tablet environment, these sets of rules can be loaded, and then beyond that, a cell phone or a mobile device can have different rules loaded as well. So based on this, you can have different rules in the same sheet be loaded based on the browsing environment that's being used, based on a desktop or laptop, based on a tablet, based on a mobile device, even something as large as a TV can have its own set of rules. Now let's jump down and break down the media queries one by one. First off, for the breakdown, you have the @media sign. This is similar to @import. It's basically a way to use a CSS property to use something that isn't necessarily pre-built in. You're actually using something that is built on top of CSS, specifically media queries. And you use the @ and the word media to create the entry. This is something that is actually very useful in CSS3. As of 15 years ago, we didn't have this. We actually had to create different style sheets for different mobile devices because mobile devices really weren't a thing back then. It was just desktops and laptops. The term screen indicates the rules within the query that should only be applied to the device screen and not when the page is printed. You can omit this if you want your rules to apply to printed pages as well. You can also change this to print if you want it to work for just print items. The word AND indicates additional criteria, duh, and the max width 899px indicates the rules within the query that should be applied when the screen width is 899 pixels or below, hence the max width. You can also use the min width property. In the example at the bottom, I want to point out that media queries are wrapped in their own curly braces. So just like you're setting a rules or a declaration block for an element, you are wrapping those inside of curly braces. You are wrapping a media query inside curly braces as well. And in between those curly braces and the rule that is being determined based on the browsing environment, you have your declaration blocks and sets of rules. So just like you have a mini embedded CSS style sheet inside this media query that is already inside the style sheet of your primary style set. Media query logic. If you're going to be developing media query, you can go desktop first or mobile first. We covered this briefly in our previous video, determining exactly how you should do things. But based on how you're developing these items, if you're going to go desktop first, then your media query rules should override existing rules as the screen gets smaller. If you do mobile first, obviously do the exact opposite. Media query rules should override existing rules as the screen gets bigger. So let's take a look at this in an example. Let's say that this media query, so @media, screen and minimum width of 500 pixels and maximum width of 700 pixels, this targets screens between 500 and 700 pixels. Easy, right? Let's change gears a bit and say media print. Well, this means that we're going to be targeting printouts. Now, for a lot of people, they're not going to print out web pages, but for some people that do, you don't want to include all that extra gobbledygook like the logo and the sidebar, a nav bar, or any blinky ads because they're pointless on paper and stuff like that. So what you can do is you can actually specify print-only specific styles. Let me give you a good example. Let's say you're on Wikipedia. Well, you're browsing Wikipedia and you want to print out this article. Well, if you're going to print it out, there's no reason to include the logo, no reason to include the sidebar with the main page, the contents, the featured content, etc. No reason to include the top bar that says not logged in, no reason to include the search bar, a bunch of other stuff that's not necessary for a printout. So you can actually specify this in a print media query by saying @media and print to tell all those items to basically disappear. Change color, change size, even change position if you want to. So that way, as soon as someone prints it out, they don't have all the extra stuff that comes with it. Go ahead, try it out. Find something on Wikipedia, take a look at it, print it out, and see what prints out versus the actual screen. Unless you specify specific rules in your printer that will print the background graphics and the styles as is, chances are you'll have a print style sheet that will remove a lot of the unnecessary items in order to, 1, save ink, but 2, save space in the paper. Alright, back to media queries. So if you're dealing with the desktop first environment, the @media and max width 700 pixels with the list of rules, this targets a max width of 700 pixels, overriding the default rules. Below that, if you have @media, max width 500 pixels and rules, this targets a max width of 500 pixels, overriding the previous 700 pixel rules. Now, based on media queries, this will only override items that have rules specified. If, for example, you have in the first rule color and backgrounds, but you only have in the second rule color, that means that color will be overridden, but background will stay the same. I'll show you what I mean in the Code With Me examples because just by verbally, this is a little confusing. If you switch it and go mobile first, say media max width 500 pixels, this targets max width of 500, overriding default, and then below that, max width of 700 pixels, this targets max width of 700 pixels, overriding 500 pixel previous rules, along with overriding the default rules. So the exact same concept, flipped in reverse, but this way you're starting with the default rules and going up from there. Any rules that are below other rules will override the previous ones as long as they are stated as well. Again, I'll explain what I mean in the Code With Me videos. Let's talk about breakpoints because you can actually have multiple media queries in the same sheet that deal with different segments once they break. So for example, if your navigation bar breaks at 700 pixels, then you can have a media query that breaks at 700 pixels to automatically restylize the navigation bar. If your column layout breaks at 600, well, have a media query that breaks at 600 and resizes that. If your floated images break at 500, well, wash, rinse, repeat. Basic concept. Now the default mobile browser behavior will actually shrink a full web page down to display inside the viewport. This is what's known as a virtual viewport. Basically what happens is that, well, if you have a mobile device, it's going to take the whole entire website that's available on the web and shrink it down to the tiny display space that is your cell phone. And that's good because it loads the full page, but it's bad as a user because once you get into the content, you quite literally have to zoom in to see anything, and then you have to scroll left, right, up, and down before you can actually realize what's going on. And that is just a pain in the tuchus. So based on that, it would be easier to have the mobile device automatically detect if a media query can be used, in which case the information in the content can be restructured, resized, or even reorganized based on the mobile environment. So to give you a good way to deal with this, you will actually use another meta tag. You previously used one to set the character sets. This one is additional. It is not overwriting. You are actually adding a meta tag. This meta tag, its name is viewport, and its content is width equals device width, and initial scale is 1.0. All of that is one value inside of content. To use a good example, let's use the AV-Tech website. Without the meta tag, mobile devices ignore the media queries and shrink the widescreen page down to fit your tiny mobile device. But with this viewport meta tag, the mobile device honors the media queries and displays the custom design that's available based on the mobile environment. Let's break this down a bit. The meta tag, well, we've used that before to specify the character encoding. It actually has multiple jobs. We're just using the second of many. Name is a generic attribute for the meta tag. In this case, it lets the browser know that the purpose is to control the sizing of the viewport. Content is a property that allows, an attribute in the meta tag. This sets the configuration options to set the viewport sizing. The first value of content is width equals device width. That's two words separated by a dash. This tells the browser to make its viewport the same width as the device's screen. And the initial scale equals 1.0, again that's two words separated by a dash, tells the browser not to zoom in or out, but display the page at its actual size, in which case that is the media query. When you deal with responsive navigation, narrow screens can't display a wide navigation bar, so the trick is to hide the navigation until needed. Some people use JavaScript, but it can be done with pure CSS, which we'll actually see in the Coded With Me videos. To give you a good example, the screen on the right gives you the full navigation when you're viewing this page on a desktop or a laptop. But on a mobile device, that whole concept is shrunk down to what's known as a hamburger menu. And based on that, this allows for the actual menu to be hidden until it is needed. So let's break this down. Well, step one is to establish the look or style by resizing, figure out exactly what needs to be done and how to do it. Step two is to include a trigger. You set up a label, you put the input right after the label, and you can have this ID be whatever you want because this is going to be the checkbox. And then below that, you have your standard navigation. Third step is to make it disappear. Fourth step is to hide the trigger from the desktop view, show the label in mobile view, and hide the navigation list. And then step 5 is to display the navigation list when checkbox is, well, checked. This is a basic example of how to do this. We'll cover this in detail once we get to the Coded With Me videos. Let's take a look at fluid text again. We've talked a lot about media queries, and now we should be able to go back to the actual calc function. But before we jump into that, I want to give you a good idea about what actually needs to be done with fluid text. There is a fairly complicated formula to do this, and this formula is minimum font size plus parentheses max font size minus minimum font size parentheses times parentheses 100 VW minus minimum window width divided by maximum window width minus minimum window width. Blech. Basically what this means is that we are basically taking the minimum font size, doing some calculations based on 100% of the view width, and basing that on the minimum view width so that we can scale up and down the fluid text. Credit goes to Mike Rithmuller, and I probably said that wrong. But if you want, you can take a look at his blog to see how he actually came up with this calculation. because based on this will actually allow for text to be easily fluidly resized between small scales and larger scales. So let's use a good example. Let's say our minimum font size is 16 pixels, minimum viewport's 320, max font size is 28, and maximum viewport is 1200. Well, the formula would look something kind of like this. Now, the easy part is plugging in the numbers. The hard part is making sure the parentheses are in the right place, especially once you actually add the calc portion to it, because you're setting font size, calc, parentheses, all this stuff in it, and having a closing parentheses. Now, if you, there's an extra parenthesis there. If you aren't a math whiz and you can't do all this in your head, don't worry, the browser does it for you. But I do want to bring the point that 3, 2, 1. What this means is that the font size, in plain English, for screens 320 pixels and narrower be 16 pixels. Scale smoothly from 16 pixels to 28 pixels while the screen width is between 321 and 1199, and for screens 1200 pixels and wider be 28 pixels. That's basically what it means in plain English. Now, if you are not a math whiz, 3, 2, 1. There is an issue with the CSS validator. Now, if you do include the full number range, then chances are it may give you an error with the calc function because there is actually a bug in the CSS validator that catches this. If you take away the minimum numbers, in which case you replace them with actual numbers, then the CSS validator may give you a passing grade. But if you have a validator error that is giving you an error based on this bug, then you can still submit your files disregarding this error by itself. Again, there are very few cases in which case an error is accepted. This is one of them only because the CSS validator has a bug in it. For setting fluid text thresholds, basically to figure this out, you'll first determine the smallest font size for the smallest viewports. For example, for the iPhone 5, the smallest viewport is 320 pixels. So the font size should be, let's say, 48 pixels. Step 2 is to determine the largest font size for the widest viewport. For a standard laptop, that's about 1600 pixels, so the biggest font size we want to go is 72. Next is coding the fluid text. The first line is the basic calculations of 48 pixels plus 72 minus 48 times 100 VW minus 320 divided by 1600 minus 320. Or, to make it a more valid concept, you could actually replace the minus numbers with just the numbers themselves, in which case 24 and 1280. That will give you the same result, but not give you the error for the CSS validator. So, in summary, we've covered responsive designs, finding breakpoints, implementing fluid width, flexible images, fluid text, responsive navigation, and media queries. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There is plenty more regarding media queries and responsive designs, or RWD, based on the web today, and who knows, that may change in a year or so, but more advanced technologies are coming their way. Responsive web design is a large stride as far as how web design has come in the past, say, 20 years, because it allows for automatic resizing based on mobile environments and based on larger environments, which makes it easier for us and easier for the browser to do the job. I do recommend you doing your own research on responsive web design to see what more is out there and how you can actually play around and change things up, because everything we've covered in this course and in this book, again, that is also the tip of the iceberg. There is plenty more out there to learn, study, experiment, and play with. So that is the last PowerPoint video for this chapter. We only have one PowerPoint video left, and that is Unit 3. But beyond this, we just have some Coded With Me videos, so hopefully you can see a bit of the responsive web design in action. If you have any questions regarding this or anything in Chapter 16, please send me an email and hit me up on Twitter, and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer.